I'm Parth Shukla. I work for AusCert, the Australian Computer Emergency Response Team. My job normally involves analysing lots of information, so that's what my presentation was on, analysing a botnet. The Carna botnet was formed to analyse the internet, to actually analyse all of the IPv4 allocated addresses. So an anonymous researcher wanted to scan all of the internet just to create a map. It's publicly addressable. There's no vulnerability there. But in order to do that, you need a botnet of a considerable size because there's 3.7 billion IPv4 addresses. And if you were to scan them one at a time, it would take you about 117 years. So, but if you had a 1.3 million devices at your hand, it would take you an hour. So that's why he created the botnet. Now, the botnet is unusual because it wasn't created by people clicking on malware or being lured into phishing scams, etc. It exploited a really simple vulnerability. So to be part of the botnet, a device must be reachable from the internet. So public IP, it had to have telnet running by default. And unfortunately, most routers and modems nowadays do. And it must allow default logins. That's essentially the Carna botnet, the 1.3 million devices that were compromised using this vulnerability. And that's what I've been focusing my analysis on. So devices, 1.3 million sounds quite bad at first. But then people go, oh, there's 3.7 billion IP addresses. Why should I care? It's probably not mine. And that's probably an okay reaction. But if you actually do statistics, if you do ratios, because it is the information of how many allocated IP addresses there are is public. So you can figure out what each country has been allocated. So APNIC would allocate Australia IP addresses, India, and that information is published. So we know how many addresses belong to India. We also know how many devices are infected in India. So we can do ratios. And using those ratios, we can get an idea of how infectious or how likely it is to find a device in a country on average. And using the statistics, I came up with figures that if you were scanning randomly at 10 IPs per second, if you just started scanning around the world randomly, it would take you about 4.5 minutes to find a vulnerable device. Now that's a much more scarier statistic than 1.3 million devices. If you were to focus your scans, so if you were a dedicated hacker, and you go, okay, actually, you know what, I think China might have more vulnerable devices, so I'm going to look up all the Chinese IP addresses and just focus on those. If they did that, then it would take them 45 seconds. So the ratio is quite worse for China. Similarly, India, it's 60 seconds. But they're not the worst. There are worse countries. One of them is Hong Kong. Hong Kong, if you were to just focus on Hong Kong ranges, it would take you about 13 seconds to find one. So the Carna botnet reveals that most devices are below 256 megs. They're not laptops, they're not desktop, they're not servers. They're just small devices that most people wouldn't look at twice. Once it works, it works. You know, if you plug in your modem, you're on the internet, end of story. You plugged in your CCTV camera, it records, end of story. So I would start with devices you wouldn't think of normally and scan them. And if you find an output port 23, you're lucky. It hasn't been infected yet. So what most likely happens is once it is infected, the port 23 would be closed. I guess I would say if people have ideas on how to deal with this problem, I've exhausted all my ideas, and I'm only one person, so there's only so much I can do. If you have ideas, I would ask you email me, and my papers and my presentations are online, so read them.